Welcome to I've Got Your Back. You've Got My Ear, Suicide Prevention in the Legal Profession. Sponsored by the American Bar Association, Center for Professional Responsibility, Commission on Lawyer Assistance Programs, and the Young Lawyers Division. Moderating the program today is Terry L. Harrell. Terry is Executive Director for the Indiana Judges and Lawyers Assistance Program and is located in Indianapolis, Indiana. Terry, please begin with the program.
Thank you. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are today. I'm going to be brief in the introduction of my colleagues today because I think the content of what our program is what's so important. I'm a lawyer and a social worker, but our real clinical expert today is Dr. Catherine Bender, or Kate. She's a psychologist with extensive knowledge and experience in suicide prevention. Lynn Garson and Stuart Monty are both practicing attorneys. You'll be able to recognize both of them by their lovely Southern accents. They are both mental health advocates. Had to click my slide. And very active with lawyer assistants in their own home states. Lawyer assistance programs began with a focus on helping lawyers deal with substance use problems, and were almost entirely volunteer organizations. Over the years, LAPs have become much broader and much more sophisticated. Most LAPs today have professional staff along with large volunteer networks. LAPs today assist people who are struggling with not only substance use disorders, but issues such as depression, anxiety, grief, secondary trauma, and much more. Most of these issues make someone more vulnerable to having suicidal thoughts. This is why most of us believe that training our volunteers to be watchful for the warning signs that someone is suicidal is the most important training we can give our volunteers. If we are unsuccessful when we ask someone to seek treatment for a substance use disorder or depression, we can always try again next week or next month or next year. We don't have to give up hope that that person will accept help at a later date, and often they do. We don't always have that luxury with suicidal thoughts. If we miss the warning signs or choose not to intervene with someone who is suicidal, we may not get a second chance. That is why it's so important that we train not just LAP volunteers, but all of us in the legal community to be sensitive to these sometimes subtle warning signs and encourage all of us to take action when we recognize those signs. Before I turn it over to Stuart to discuss the ethical implications, I want to remind you that we will have time for we will respond to questions that we don't get to at the end by email. And Lynn suggested that I also let you know that we are going to start with the more clinical, intellectual information, but we will drill down and get to what it really looks like and feels like in your own office when you or a colleague are struggling. Stuart, would you begin and cover the ethical, professional responsibility issues that arise when a lawyer is struggling with a mental health issue?
Thank you, Terry. First, we want to just acknowledge that the model rules of professional conduct are implicated when we have an impaired lawyer. And beginning with just a couple of those, first in terms of the effective representation of the client, we're not going to go through the rules in detail, but just note that where you can find these rules, clearly a lawyer's competence may be an issue when there's an impairment. Rule 1.3, diligence. Duty to keep client reasonably informed, 1.4, and potentially the duty to decline representation, 1.16, if the impairment is more significant. Also, if you are a partner or supervising another lawyer in a law firm and you have concerns that your colleague is impaired, then you may have some responsibilities. And I think it's important to understand those rules, and you can see there on the slide both some description of the rules that may be relevant, including the one, 8.3, that involves your duty to report professional misconduct. Obviously, our hope is that we get help for these folks before we actually need to report them for a rules violation. A couple of ABA formal opinions are relevant, particularly the ABA Formal Opinion 03-429. If you are a managing partner in a law firm and an associate comes to you and says there's a senior associate that has a serious drinking problem or drug problem, the information's credible, detailed, alarming, it may implicate trust fund violations or other misconduct. The question is, what do you do? Formal Opinion 03-429 answers the questions for us in terms of what you need to do. Obviously, one of the first things you can do is contact your state's lawyer assistance program and receive some excellent guidance from professionals such as we have on the program today in your state. The opinion also sets forth the steps that may be reasonable under the circumstances to protect the interests of clients. That may include consulting with psychiatrists or other professionals, suggestions for confronting the lawyer with the evidence of impairment, recommendations to require the lawyer to seek assistance, and accommodations that may support the lawyer's treatment and recovery. And certainly, discussion of steps to prevent the lawyer from rendering legal advice to clients if that is appropriate. That's probably enough on the ethical issues, but I think it's important for us to understand the need to discuss the issues with your lawyer's assistance program. If you follow the suggestions in the formal opinions, then you have probably done your job ethically and responsibly, and in the process, hopefully, saved someone's life and career. So I'm going to turn it over to the next group.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you so much. Kate and I are going to address the question of whether lawyers are at a significant risk for suicide, and to some extent the more difficult question of why that might be. Can you start us off, Kate?
Sure, I'm happy to. Thank you. And I know in the introductions we talked a little bit about the fact that I'm the programming director for the Dave Nee Foundation. So to start us off in talking about the prevalence of depression and mental health issues within the field of law, I want to talk briefly about the story of Dave Nee. And we're not able to show videos throughout this webinar, but there's twice that we will make reference to a video, and it will be sent out in the follow-up materials. But when I describe Dave Nee, I often talk about the fact that Dave Nee was a go-to person, a bit of a resource person, so perhaps some of you can think about who in your life you consider to be a go-to person. And Dave was a go-to person for his Princeton undergrad classmates. He was the go-to person for his little sister Alex, and certainly was the go-to person for Fordham Law, class of 2005, Section 7. And Dave, back in 2005, had a job lined up for him after law school. He was really involved with moot court, and as many of his friends would say, he was brilliant and could outperform them on exams, even if he didn't attend as many classes as they did. And so everybody was taken aback when, while studying for the bar, Dave died by suicide. And Dave's friends, as they will speak, they will say, you know, we were trained as law students to do research, and so we wanted to understand more about this, and we found out that lawyers and law students have higher rates of depression than the general population. So that's a little bit about why we do what we do. And here are some of those statistics that Dave's friends and family who founded the organization came across. So I always say when I talk about this first statistic, I suppose it depends if you're someone who is glass half empty or half full, but only half of lawyers report they're very satisfied or satisfied with their work. There's one research study that indicates lawyers are 3.6 times more likely to suffer from depression than non-lawyers. And for those attorneys who are seeking mental health help, depression and anxiety is cited by 26% of those. I think that's a bit misleading, because what we'll talk about today is that this is a profession where a lot of people are not likely to seek help, and so that 26% is just for those who are seeking help. And lawyers rank in the top 5 for occupations who die by suicide. So in terms of the severity of the problem, we back in the spring of 2014, the Dave Neef Foundation, along with helped to support a study that was run by David Jaffe from American University, Washington College of Law, and Jerry Organ from the University of St. Thomas. And what we found in this survey of law students, and we surveyed students from 15 different law schools across the country, and we asked them about their thoughts on suicide and self-injury, and we found that 20% reported that they had thought seriously about suicide at some point in their life, and 6% had thought seriously about it in the last 12 months. 9% reported that they had hurt themselves in the last 12 months, and we'll talk at the end of this webinar about the differences between self-injurious behavior and suicidal thinking. And of those who had reported self-injurious behavior, 17% of those had done so 2 or more times in the last 2 months. So that's it about some of the law students, but Terry's going to talk with you about a recent study that was conducted about the prevalence of substance use and mental health in today's attorneys.
Absolutely. This study was a collaboration between the American Bar Association, Commission on Lawyer Assistance Programs, and the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. In addition, they had assistance from bar associations all over the country. I'm just so excited to tell you that this is the first really large-scale study on substance use and mental health issues in practicing attorneys. It was just published last month in the Journal of Addiction Medicine, and unlike previous small-scale studies that we've had before, this survey looked at approximately 13,000 practicing attorneys from 19 different states. So we feel like we have some really good data to talk to you about today. The study used an instrument called the audit, which is the Alcohol Use Disorders Identification Test. And it's a questionnaire that looks at hazardous, harmful, and potentially alcohol-dependent drinking, or what we're going to call problematic or problem drinking. The full audit is 10 questions that look at quantity and frequency of use, but also at consequences that flow from the use of alcohol. They also use a subset of the audit called the Audit C, which is the first 3 questions of the audit that asks only about quantity and frequency of use. It doesn't get into the consequences or repercussions of drinking. And the audit is not diagnostic because it's purely a simple self-report, but it does correlate very closely with substance use disorders. And what it found out of these 13,000 attorneys was that 20.6% of attorneys scored in the area of being problem drinkers. Now to contrast that, the same study was given to a workforce. It was a highly educated workforce, and they came back with 11.8% as being problem drinkers. So attorneys were much, much higher. They then gave the Audit C, just the first 3 questions of the test, to the attorneys, and they did that on purpose because they knew someone else had recently given the first 3 questions to a group of physicians. And attorneys, as you can see on the slide, attorneys came out at 36.4% of the attorneys showed as problem drinkers based purely on the amount and frequency of use versus 15% of the physicians, so more than double the rate of the physicians. So I want to be clear that the Audit C is purely based on the amount of drinking, whereas the full audit includes negative consequences from drinking. So I'll just ask you to ponder. Do you think that attorneys are better drinkers than physicians, that we are able to drink higher amounts of alcohol and drink more frequently without any negative consequences than physicians? Or is it possible that a good number of attorneys are not aware of or are in denial of the negative consequences that are associated with their drinking? There may be more possibilities than that, but those are the 2 that occur to me to try and look at why those 2 numbers are so different. The important thing for this presentation is that I think Kate will talk more about the fact that heavy drinking, hazardous drinking, is highly correlated with suicidal behavior. That's why this information is so critical to us today. The study also looked at rates of depression, anxiety, and stress in attorneys. other variables that correlate with suicide as well. And this test was called the DASS, Depression, Anxiety, Stress Scale. And it asked for current symptoms of depression, anxiety, or stress in the attorneys taking the survey. And this is a snapshot. This is not long-term. This is who is experiencing symptoms at this moment. 28% had symptoms of depression. 19% were suffering from symptoms of anxiety, which frankly, in my experience as a lab director, that seems really low. But that's what it found. And then 23% were showing symptoms of stress. What I think is even more interesting is the question they asked the attorneys, have you had trouble with any of these mental health issues during the course of your legal career? And as someone who serves the legal profession, when they have personal problems like this, I found it very enlightening to know that in the course of one's career, almost 50% of us, almost 50% of the lawyers said they had trouble with depression at some point in their legal career. 61% had trouble with anxiety, and that is more aligned with my experience. Social anxiety, ADHD, and again, for today, 11.5% responded that they had had suicidal thoughts during their legal career. So when you're wondering if maybe a colleague of yours is hurting that much that they might be having suicidal thoughts, remember that it's not uncommon in our profession. Some other significant findings: participants classified as non-problematic drinkers had lower levels of depression, anxiety, and stress. That may be obvious, but in terms of suicide, I want to point out that so that must mean that the problem drinkers have higher levels of depression, anxiety, and stress. Any one of these variables can put you at risk for suicide, and many of these people may have multiple factors that increase their risk for suicide. Oops, and I'm going to go back because I missed an important point, the younger attorneys. Attorneys 30 years of age or younger reported higher rates of problematic drinking. This was kind of a surprise to those of us in the field. We had kind of thought that alcohol problems got worse over time, kind of developed, but indeed the younger lawyers had much higher rates of problem drinking in this survey. Again, with the association between heavy drinking and suicide, I think it means we may need to look much harder and be much more watchful for suicidal thinking in our young attorneys. I'm old, but I was trained to look for suicide in older men and in adolescents, not necessarily at a 26-year-old lawyer, but I think that may be changing. We may need to be much more aware and watchful with our younger lawyers. The barriers. Lawyers are very concerned about seeking help. They're afraid that if word gets out, it will hurt their reputation or hurt their career in some way. And we have to find ways to make it acceptable and safe for attorneys to seek treatment and other kinds of help. We need to decrease the stigma that goes with these disorders and with the idea of seeking help. We need to increase the understanding that people have that these issues are actually common. There's no shame. They are very common issues, and that they're very treatable in addition. I'm going to turn it back over to Kate now and let her talk to you more about the factors that increase our risk of suicide. Kate?
Thank you, Terry. And as was mentioned before, you will get a link to this CNN clip that previewed in January of 2014 that talks specifically about the high rate of suicide among attorneys and how common it is, and it really emphasizes the fact that this is an issue that so many in the field face. So we want to talk a little bit about, well, why is that? What are some potential contributing factors towards higher rates of mental health issues and higher rates of suicide? So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of these, and my guess is that some of you might be able to list some of your own thoughts as to why there are higher rates. So let's talk a little bit about isolation, and we really see that this begins actually in law school because it is such a competitive environment. We find that students are working independently as opposed to working collaboratively because of the competitive environment. And so that feels isolating when they're in school, but they also feel isolated from their friends and families who might not have gone through law school and don't necessarily understand what it is that they're going through. And so while it begins in law school, we also see that it carries out to people who are in practice. So again, long hours, people not necessarily understanding all of those long hours, and the competitive nature in terms of trying to make partner and increase billable hours. Along with isolation, we see this pressure, again, beginning in law school with an expectation to be an expert, to be in that top 10%, to be the person who's bringing in the most billable hours, and also that your clients have this expectation that they're paying you for a selective skill and that you're going to be the expert and be able to solve their problem. I often talk about a T-shirt that I saw on someone once that said, you know, I'm an attorney, not a magician. And I think some people have that expectation that lawyers will magically wave their wand and things will be cured. I talked a little bit about that pressure to perform. One thing that we want to talk about sort of in conjunction with one another is the vicarious trauma, as well as having an analytical perspective versus an emotional perspective. I often talk about the fact that you and I might both be called counselors. And in that sense, we might both hear stories of people who are in very difficult situations or times in their lives. And the difference is that lawyers who are trained very much to quote-unquote think like a lawyer, they're not necessarily encouraged to think about how this is impacting them emotionally, but rather to think about things from an analytical perspective. And that analytical perspective and that ability to make an argument and think logically is certainly a necessary skill for attorneys. So what becomes difficult is learning how to turn that skill on and learning how to turn it off when appropriate. And so what we find is happening is there's a lot of compartmentalization, and people are simply ignoring their emotions. And again, they're dealing with things, as attorneys, you're dealing with things that are very hard and perhaps traumatic, and so you might take on some of that trauma. Another thing that's unique to the profession, a lot of people in research in positive psychology says that, you know, lawyers and law students are fascinating because most professions are rewarded for being optimistic, and yet in the field of law, law students and lawyers are rewarded for being pessimistic, sort of thinking about that worst case scenario and being prepared for the worst case scenario. And again, it's a skill set that's good. One of our board members will talk about, you know, my clients really appreciate that I think about that worst case scenario, but at the time his fiance didn't necessarily think about, you know, thinking about the worst case scenario when wanting to have their wedding pictures taken outside. That's not always helpful. So it's about the time and place for turning those skills on. And as we've talked so much about the stigma, so we know that law students and lawyers are hesitant to get help for the social stigma and fear of professional consequences. So we really hope that by the ABA offering this today and all of you attending, we can help to reduce that stigma. These are some theories that are specific to why it is that people die by suicide, and so I'm just going to gloss over them briefly in terms of how they connect to the legal field. So there's the escape theory, which says that people die by suicide for fear that they have fallen short of a standard, whether that's an internally place standard or an external place standard. And so is the idea of not being able to lead up to expectations that might actually border on perfectionism. And we know that a lot of the type of people who are attracted to the field of law do fall into that, trying to having unrealistic expectations, again, either imposed on them or by themselves or by others. And so they can fall into that. The hopelessness theory says more than anything, what can lead someone to die by suicide is that they feel no sense of hope. And it is possible, as we just talked about, when someone is feeling pessimistic all the time and dealing with very traumatic and tragic events, that they might lose hope. And then the interpersonal theory of suicide by Thomas Joyner talks about how people who experience a lack of sense of belonging, those who feel particularly lonely, whether that's a perceived loneliness or a real loneliness, if they have a capacity to inflict pain or harm on themselves. So, we oftentimes people will make jokes about attorneys, and no one likes to hear from their attorneys. Well, that certainly can lead to a sense of not belonging or a sense of loneliness. So those are just some of the theories of suicide and how they might connect to the legal profession.
Thank you, Kate. I think that's about enough on statistics and theory. We're going to move into what it looks like and feels like from a perspective of a practicing attorney. Stuart?
I would like to share, thank you, Terry. I would like to share a few thoughts about why I care about mental health issues. I've been a mental health advocate for a number of years, including a volunteer with the South Carolina Lawyers Helping Lawyers program. And as I mentioned, most of the states have an ABA program like that. I want to share with you some words from James Taylor, who wrote a song called Down in the Hole. And here are some of the words to that song. Welcome down underground. Hunker down a spell. Gets to feel like home to me, though I know it looks like hell. Down in the hole, Lord, it's deep, and the sides are steep, and the nights are long and cold. Down in the hole. Light and love and the world above mean nothing to the mole down in the hole. James Taylor called that song, Down in the Hole, his anthem to depression. He did that because he had been there. He had been down in the hole. He knew about the hole, so deep, so dark, the sides so steep, with no obvious way out. He had been there, and I have been there. Some 24 years ago, when I was an associate in our law firm, during a time in which I had been feeling down and not myself, things not going my way at work, a case or two that went badly. I had lost interest in most activities, was more tired, less energy. I had trouble thinking and concentrating at work. I was one thing that no client wants, and that was I was terribly indecisive. I'd be at work for hours on end and find myself at the end of the day not having accomplished much of anything. I was more irritable and emotional, particularly at home. And I experienced a change in my sleeping habits that I had never experienced before. I'd never had trouble going to sleep, much to the dismay of my wife. However, during that time, I began to wake up early in the morning around 4:30, not be able to go back to sleep. It's a terrible feeling. It's an insidious form of insomnia. You think you're going back to sleep, but you never do, and as a result, you wake up more tired than when you went to sleep the previous night. My wife was probably the first to notice that I was not myself. All of the things that I just mentioned are the warning signs for depression or being down in the hole. The hole so deep, so dark, so steep, with no obvious way out. Some of you may be familiar with William Styron, an American novelist, best known perhaps for Sophie's Choice, which was made into a movie, other novels as well. In 1985, Styron suffered from a serious clinical depression, which he would later write about in his book, Darkness Visible. And in that book, Styron talked about his descent into depression and his attempted suicide, and also the triumph of recovery from that. And I want to share with you just a few words from Styron's book about the way he described depression. The decision-making of daily life involves not, as in normal affairs, shifting from one annoying situation to another less annoying, or from discomfort to relative comfort, or from boredom to activity, but moving from pain to pain. One does not abandon, even briefly, one's bed of nails, but is attached to it wherever one goes. Styron described the madness of depression as a storm of murk, the slowed down responses, the energy throttled back to zero. Your body is affected and feels sapped and drained. So what did I do? I got help. I'm one of those with depression who was successfully treated with the support of my wife and my law firm and the help of medication and antidepressant. I slowly came out of the hole and back into the light. It wasn't quick or easy, but slowly I climbed out of that hole. I could not have done it by myself. No amount of alcohol or vacation or pulling myself up by my bootstraps would have done it. I needed help. I got it and got better. Now, my story is not terribly dramatic in the sense I did not lose my job. I was never suicidal, actually. I was never hospitalized, but I was sick, and I got help and got better. At the time I first had the problem, I was an associate at our law firm, Galvin, White & Boyd in South Carolina. About a year after experiencing the problem and having recovered and climbed out of the hole, I became a partner in the law firm where I continue to practice today. Someone has said that depression is a forever kind of illness, and it certainly has been for me, but you just have to watch over it and make sure you're doing the things you need to do to stay healthy. So the message really is depression is a medical illness, first of all, and not a personal weakness. And second, depression is a medical problem that can be successfully treated with medication and therapy. And third, if you or someone you know has a problem, get help from a medical professional. So I'm going to turn it over to Lynn now so that you can hear from her.
Thank you very much, Stuart. What you're seeing on that page is the cover of a book that I published in 2012 that describes two things that I want to make clear. One is how bad things can get. You've heard a little bit of that from Stuart. You've seen some statistics, and I'm going to describe even more so that people who don't really understand how could somebody feel suicidal might get a better appreciation for that. And then the second part of the book, which I also hope will be your takeaway, is how much hope there is for recovery, even from being completely bottom of the barrel. So in my case, how bad was bad? Well, I had lifelong struggles with depression. I would cycle 2 to 4 months in and out of it, and that began when I was quite young. I think I first recognized it when I was 16 years old. It was still ongoing through college, through law school, through my marriage, through raising children, and then I hit December of 2007, and that was a whole new ball game. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I was working full-time. I was working in Virginia for a healthcare system at the time, in-house counsel, and I was working very hard through this and trying to push myself. So, for example, I remember closing 2 deals in December of 2007 while at the same time having to lie down on the floor just to try to breathe. I literally could not breathe. Then I would get up again and go close another deal. And this went on for 6 months, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every single minute of every single day. And after about 5 months of that, I became what I would call pre-suicidal, which means, and this is a layman's way of referring to it, but what it means is I did not have a plan. I had not stockpiled pills. I didn't have a gun. Nothing like that. But I do remember one day driving down the street towards the grocery store, and Harris Teeter was one of the big stores where I lived. So I'm driving to Harris Teeter, and there was a car coming towards me in the other lane, facing me, and I had the very clear thought that if that car turned the wheel and ended up coming in my lane towards a head-on collision for my car, I would not do anything. I wouldn't turn the wheel to get out of the way. And that is what I consider pre-suicidal. I was passive. I was not active, but I was in so much pain that if anything had happened to take away that pain, I would have been okay with that. It was soon after that that I went into the hospital.
a very fine institution. It's called Sheppard Pratt in Baltimore, and they have a facility called The Retreat, and that is what I went into. And first 3 weeks there, I was there for 10 weeks. It was a very long, well, in some ways a very long stay, in other respects maybe a too short of a stay. But I remember going to talk to the psychiatrist who was helping me. And just before I went in, I thought, well, it might be useful to just jot down a list of my daily physical symptoms. You know, I'm a lawyer, I make lists, so, you know, that might help with my treatment. And so I'm going to read to you, I still have the envelope, by the way, that I wrote it down, but I'm going to read you just a portion of what the physical symptoms were that I wrote for him. So, trouble drawing a deep breath, shoulders hunched and tight, bones popping in my neck, twitching, aching jaw from clenching my teeth, trouble falling asleep, waking up 3 to 4 times a night, hot and cold, shaking violently, particularly in the hours after waking up, blurred and grainy vision, chattering teeth, trouble writing by hand, constantly losing my balance, nearly falling asleep while driving, tightness in my chest, feeling like my blood was sizzling, sudden high blood pressure, and inability to concentrate. And that's just a partial list. You know, I remember, for example, when I was in the hospital there, they would sometimes serve peas for dinner. And when I say shaking violently, there was no way that I could hold peas on a fork. And at the time it was somewhat humorous. You know, you have to get a little bit of humor out of that. But I want to also draw your attention to the fact these are only the physical side of things. If you add fear, sadness, hopelessness, as Kate referred to in one of her slides, dullness, fog, and confusion, perhaps you can begin to understand how suicide seemed like a viable way out. And I want to mention, I was not a person who had ever thought that suicide would be part of my playbook, not even in my vocabulary. So it's an indication of how low I had gotten, how desperate I was, and how much pain I was in. So after 3 weeks in that hospital, I was given a prognosis, and I was all geared up for this. You know, these were the pros after all, and they were going to make me better. We were paying a ton of money. And here comes the prognosis. Fair to good with ongoing intensive treatment. Well, I rejected that out of hand. I said, are you kidding me? I need to get better. I need to walk out of here. I've got a law practice to go back to. I've got a life. I've got a family. What do you mean by ongoing intensive treatment? Well, what that meant was going to therapy 3 to 4 times a week. And I absolutely laughed in the psychiatrist's face. No way, not doing it, not thinking about it. You know, I'll take your help while I'm here and just make me better. Well, I rejected that advice at my peril, and I was back in a far less elegant and less noteworthy institution less than a year and a half later. And I will say 2 notable things happened at that particular institution. One is that they took me off of all drugs. I had been on psych meds for 29 years in various titrations and various combinations. And in my particular case, the best thing that could have happened to me is to take them all away, because I finally accepted that there was no magic pill for me and really devoted my attention to what I needed to do to work to get better. The other very interesting thing that the director of this facility told my brother, who had come in for the family session, was that I would never work again and I should apply for Social Security disability. And needless to say, I took that very hard. I didn't really believe it, which I'm grateful for. But I trusted him. You know, he was the pro. And I did, in fact, fill out an application for Social Security disability. I will say that pushing the button to file that online was maybe one of the hardest things I've ever done. I got rejected, which happens to everybody, as I understand it. But at the same time, I was applying for jobs. And I got one in August of 2010 after coming out of this facility in May of 2010. And part of what has made it viable from then until now, where I'm still working full-time, as you know, I'm at Baker Hostetler, is that I finally said yes to the ongoing intensive treatment prognosis that was part of what they had told me in 2008. I accepted that this was part of my life, like being diabetic and having chronic issues of any type are part of some other people's lives, and that I needed to do what it took to keep myself as stable as I could. And that, in fact, does include both group and individual therapy 3 times a week, total of 3 times a week. I also accepted the fact that recovery for me would not be linear. It was not, up and away and never have any problems again. That was a big surprise for me, and I think it is for a lot of people. I still have some extremely low times, but the difference now is that I've got a lot of consistent support in place, and I make use of it, and that's made all the difference for me. So what I want your takeaway to be is that no matter how low you or somebody you care about goes, there is always hope that they can come all the way back. And I think now we're going to move on to assessing and responding.
Right. I first want to thank you, Lynn and Stuart, both for sharing some of your personal experiences. And I think Lynn and Kate are going to talk to us about what we should be watching for and what we should actually do when we recognize that a colleague is struggling.
Thank you. And so what we wanted to do, we certainly want to talk with folks and make people feel comfortable with recognizing warning signs of when someone might be at risk for suicide. But we thought we would start a little bit with sort of this mental health 101. And so, when someone talks about being in good physical health, we all seem to know what that means. We have a certain set of numbers to follow. It means, a blood pressure rate of a certain amount. It means a BMI of a certain level. But we rarely talk about, well, what does good mental health look like, and what would that be? So, ideally, when someone is experiencing good mental health, it means that they are experiencing peace and balance, and that there is peace and balance between their social lives, their emotional lives, and their psychological lives. And so that's all very ideal, but I don't know how many of us on this webinar have a life that looks like this picture. And so, what happens is, even though that's the ideal, just like our doctor tells us, what would be an ideal BMI, sometimes we are not at that number. And so sometimes, as is clearly happening for the child in this picture, sometimes things go wrong. And so what we would want for you to gain from this webinar today is, okay, so when is it that things are going wrong and there might be a mental health issue at hand, and sort of understanding that distinction between a normal reaction to an abnormal situation and when something has moved into something more clinical. So Lynn and I are going to try to go back and forth between what I would say is sort of the clinician side of symptoms to look out for, but as Lynn just shared and will continue to share, she'll talk a little bit about, what does that look like in your office. So some of the physical symptoms that people might experience are listed here: high blood pressure, rapid heartbeat, jaw clenching. Lynn mentioned a little bit of this in the excerpt from her book with the jaw clenching and the feeling out of breath, fatigue, and headaches. And I want to be clear that I don't want people to leave the webinar thinking that, okay, I have a problem clenching my jaw, therefore I must be clinically depressed. What we want you to do is to be mindful of some of these symptoms, and we'll talk with you about how to make that distinction. So these are some of the physical symptoms, and Lynn is going to talk a little bit more about what it's like, how that shows up in an office.
Yeah, so I thought it was sort of interesting to go around and talk to some of my coworkers about what did they notice in me. As I mentioned, it hasn't been a linear recovery. There have been times in the office where I've not been in great shape, and people have been aware of it, at least certain people. And I thought, well, it would be sort of interesting to see what is it that they noticed about me. And I knew there was at least one other person in our firm who had also had some struggles and asked about that as well. So I'm not going to go over every single one. Certainly everybody always hears about changes in weight. I know that in 2007 to 2008, in like 4 months, I have no idea how much weight I lost. It was a tremendous amount because I couldn't eat. It was very clear that there was something going on. If you go through many of these, you'll see that the header, the little banner up at the top, when you know a person, you know what is normal and what is not normal. That really characterizes a lot of the bullet points. You just know it. You know, this is not the way that person usually smiles. Their eyes are sort of faded. They're less talkative. One that I noticed in a friend in the last few months, a person who was immaculately groomed most of the time was all of a sudden showing up without washing their hair. And that was just very obvious that something was going on. So many of these are things that, again, as Kate said, if some of these things are going on, it doesn't mean that somebody's clinically depressed, but you start to look. You know, that's what you can do. The colleagues who notice these things about me, if it went on for a little while, they would come up to me and say, "Are you doing okay? You know, is everything all right? Is there anything you'd like to talk about?" And I would either say yes or no. You know, it's always anybody's choice how to respond to that. But that's what I think is how you can take care of each other as colleagues.
Thanks, Lynn. I think one of the things that Lynn has written here that we'll talk a little bit more about is things like, you know, asking for assignments that can be performed in his or her office without really interaction. So if you notice, oh, okay, well, maybe that person just finds that they're more productive by being behind a closed door, it could be symptomatic of something else. And so, you know, I just wanted to point that out. Some of the, again, sort of more clinical things, you know, Lynn certainly mentioned weight. And so when I talk about some of the symptoms, I talk with people about language that we are probably all familiar with. So when people talk about, you know, having butterflies in their stomach, they often talk about, you know, they're nervous. And when they have that sort of butterflies in their stomach, they don't necessarily feel like eating. And that's what Lynn just mentioned. She wasn't able to eat. And so, therefore, there was a noticeable change in her weight. For some people, it's the opposite. And so we have all heard of that term comfort food. And so it could be that people feel sad or feel irritable or feel angry, and they don't want to feel that way. They want to feel comforted, and so they turn to food because the food is there and the food isn't going to judge them. So definitely want to look out for changes in your own weight or changes in someone that you care about, changes in their weight. You also want to look out for mood, and I think a lot of times people talk about a shift in mood. So, okay, well, that person seemed really happy yesterday and they seem really sad today. And certainly you would want to look out for mood swings like that. But you also want to take notice of, you know, Lynn mentioned that about the smile, but, you know, if someone seems very flat when they're describing how excited they were to go to their son or daughter's baseball game, and they're saying that they're excited, but their expression is just very flat and doesn't seem to match with what they're saying. So the idea is people should be able to experience a range of emotions and not get stuck in any one particular. So if you're noticing someone seems really flat or they just seem stuck in an emotion, and sleep. And so maybe you notice, hopefully you would notice if someone was falling asleep, you know, during a meeting or falling asleep at their desk, but maybe it's the opposite. Maybe they seem totally alert all the time because they're really utilizing caffeinated beverages all the time. So maybe their speech seems very rapid. You know, I've talked before about, you know, Terry went over some of the statistics about 61% of the attorneys in this study talked about experiencing levels of anxiety, and we found that, you know, law students, about 34% experience symptoms of anxiety. And so we know this is a group that experiences a lot of anxiety. And I've had people say, you know, I'd be worried about students who are not anxious about taking the bar exam or anything like that. And it is, you know, a healthy amount of anxiety is sort of what motivates people. But when that level of anxiety is interfering with your ability to function and your ability to, on a daily basis, that's when it becomes problematic. And if you notice someone, you know, there's that great scene from what is that movie, The Office Space, where they are, you see someone freaking out about the printer not working. And so it's seen as a very comical scene, but if you see someone who's really overreacting to a situation, that could be a signal that there is something going on, or someone just expresses a real sense of a lack of purpose and a lack of belonging. So one of the things that we try to do to encourage people to sort of make the distinctions between, okay, I did notice, some changes in that person, but, should I get involved, or, I've noticed this in myself. There are two phrases that we encourage people to ask when they're talking about some of these symptoms that we just went over. We want you to ask, are any of those symptoms interfering with your ability to work, play, or love, or your colleagues' ability to work, play, or love? And so obviously you all work in some capacity as an attorney. Hopefully you all play, as in you have leisure activities, and hopefully you're all in relationships, whether those are family relationships, romantic relationships. So if any of those symptoms, the irritability, the wanting to be alone, are getting in the way of your ability to work, play, or love, we'd want you to talk with someone. And we also want you to monitor, some of those symptoms, the jaw clenching, the sleepless nights. How frequently are they happening? How intense is it? And how long has it been going on? So typically we say that if people are experiencing these symptoms for a period of 2 weeks or more, we would encourage you to talk with somebody. We do know that this is a group of people that is extremely private and confidential. There are online resources that are available to folks that help to monitor and track these symptoms. Screening for Mental Health is a great partner of ours, and you can go to their screening tool and take an assessment. There also Law Lifeline is specific for law students. It's geared towards law students rather, but the self-assessment can be done by anybody. And so those are just some screening tools that are available to folks online. And we know that unfortunately this is a group that is hesitant to seek help, and they sometimes think that they can handle the problem on their own. And what we find when people are trying to handle it on their own or ignoring it, we see that leads to higher rates of substance use and higher rates of suicidal thinking. And so one of the things that we wanted to do today is talk a little bit about the distinction between risk factors for suicide and warning signs of suicide. And so again, if we make comparisons to physical health, one might say that one might be at higher risk of heart disease if there's a family history of that, or if perhaps they are overweight. That's different than showing up at the emergency room because they are experiencing a shortness of breath and heart palpitations. So the warning signs are those that are more imminent. The risk factors are less imminent. Some of the risk factors for suicide would include a previous suicide attempt, if someone has substantial psychiatric problems, such as schizophrenia. If we see there's what we call co-occurring, which really means that someone have alcohol or substance use issues in addition to mental health issues. If someone is resistant to seeking mental health treatment, if they have that ability to inflict pain on themselves, and also some people argue that someone's sex and age might also be risk factors. For example, we know more men die by suicide than women, and that the age is heightened, or suicide risk is increased from 15 to 24, but also, again, with middle-aged men, and then again for the elderly. Some of the warning signs, so these would be more immediate. This is from the American Association of Suicidology. So these are warning signs that someone may or may not be someone might be at risk for suicide. So the is ideation and substance use, and ideation is really just a fancy way of saying, does someone have the idea of death? Maybe if someone were to say, if I don't win this case, I'm going to jump off the top of the building, that is a very obvious, sign, but it might be more subtle. Someone might all of a sudden ask you, hey, would you, I can't care for my cat anymore, would you take my cat? So they start giving away things, or if it just seems like they're starting to prepare to not be there. Substance use, especially an increase in substance use. So Terry mentioned at the beginning some of the statistics. We do see correlation between increase in substance use and suicidal actions and behaviors. Past purposelessness, anxiety, trapped, and hopelessness. And so purposelessness is beyond just, hey, why did I become an attorney? It's more to, why are people friends with me? What is my purpose on this earth? What do I bring to the table? Really questioning levels of self-worth. And then feelings of anxiety, trapped, and hopelessness. What can happen when people are experiencing really clinically significant anxiety is they start to fall into a pattern of thinking that clinically we call, catastrophic thinking. So, for example, something like, if I don't win this case, I'm going to lose my job, and if I lose my job, I am going to lose my house because I'll have no way of paying the mortgage, and then if I lose my house, my family and I will not have a place to live. And so starting to feel that sense of trapped and that sense of hopelessness. And finally, warm, withdrawal, anger, recklessness, and mood change. So, Lynn was listed on that. If someone starts to ask for assignments that they can do in isolation, so that's a change, that's withdrawing. A lot of times anger and recklessness go sort of undetected, or people are not necessarily willing to point them out in men because it's a gender stereotype, but sometimes we say, oh, that's just boys being boys. There's an idea that men experience depression outward in anger and rage, and women experience it inward. So if you start to see someone engaging in reckless behavior, that could be a sign, and then a mood change. And as Lynn said, when you know someone, you know when something is out of character for them. So even if it seems minor that all of a sudden they're coming into work late every day, it might be a clue that something else is going on. And we're going to talk about, what do you do if you've identified a problem, and Lynn's going to talk about what not to do based on her personal experience.
Kate, before I do that, I'm going to ask you to back up to the Is Path Warm slide. There's a couple of things I wanted to say about just my personal experience. So what resonated for me on here was the PATH part of it. And as you were talking, I haven't thought for a long time about this, but a significant part of how I felt was trapped and certainly hopeless, anxious. When you talked about catastrophic thinking, every single email I got for a period of months caused a spike in my adrenaline as if I had been on an airplane that had just hit an air pocket and was in free fall. Every single one. And I literally sometimes would have to open an email, look at it real fast, and then close it, and catch my breath, and then open it again and realize it's just an email. Somebody's just asking me a question. I can answer this. But I definitely remember that. I remember feeling trapped, and I also want to point out that all of this was internal. In many instances, if you looked at me, you would say, everything's fine, she's got a nice job, her house is fine, good relationship with her children, family's okay. What could possibly be wrong? And the answer to that is, from your perspective, nothing. But the only thing that matters is how that person feels. And I felt purposeless, hopeless, completely trapped, which is also interesting to me because I had somehow bought into this idea that I had no choice about anything. And that was why I felt trapped. I did have choices. We all have choices. But my mindset at that moment was that I was shut down, had no choices, nothing was ever going to get better, And that's the reason why I had suicidal ideation. So thanks, Kate, for indulging me. Yeah. So what we're going to talk about here is a list, as Kate said, of on the personal side things not to do, and then also Kate will talk on the clinical side. So unengaged listening, what is that? Well, that's when you're texting while somebody's trying to tell you about a deep personal struggle. And I say that particularly, it sounds like I'm being, trying to be off the cuff about it, but I'm really not, because a lot of times nowadays people will text no matter what you're saying to them. And if you're pouring out your heart or, even in a mild way, sort of indicating that something's wrong, you want the person listening to you to be engaged in what you're talking about. The next one everybody's heard ad nauseum, don't tell somebody pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's not helpful and it's not doable. Now, I'd like to contrast that with encouraging a person to be responsible for his or her own recovery. That's a completely different thing than saying, you can do it, or what's the matter with you? I had hard times too. You can do this. That's a thing not to do. To do is to offer help and to also encourage the person to help themselves, because what I ultimately found is that while I didn't believe it for a long time, the only person who could take charge of my recovery was me. And I didn't get better until I took charge of my own recovery. The next is a favorite of mine. I got this from a colleague. Do not listen to reload. Lawyers do that, I think, more than other folks, and what it means is while you're talking to me, I'm not really listening to you. I'm just planning my response. But of course I know better, and I've got a great logical argument that's going to completely tear apart what you said to me, so I'm just listening to reload. Well, maybe good when you're practicing law, not so good when you're trying to listen to somebody who's struggling. Finally, this is not the time to tell your own story. I know there's the expression, misery loves company. In this case, the person really wants to talk about themselves, and they're looking for a good listener. They're not really looking to hear your story.
Thanks. And some of the do nots, for clinically speaking, are similar. So you don't want to judge somebody or impose your own personal beliefs. You don't want to say something like, "Oh, but everything is going so great for you." That's not, again, as Lynn said, that's not how the person feels. You don't want to promise secrecy, especially if a person is talking about ending his or her life. And you certainly don't want to minimize what the person is going through, nor do you want to ignore it. And I think there is this whole sense of, oh, well, that's not my responsibility. I'm not their family member, that's a colleague. But we really don't want to ignore if we're noticing these symptoms in someone, because we know that untreated mental health issues can lead to suicide, and we certainly don't want to minimize what someone is going through. And I think sometimes we do that because we just want them to feel better, and we think that if we minimize it, they will feel better, but it's not helpful. So we'll talk about, what you can do to be helpful.
Yeah, and some of these are actually what you can do for yourself when you're struggling. So the first flies in the face of everything we feel as lawyers, flies in the face of encountering stigma. It's counterintuitive, but for me, I have to say being open about what's going on with me has been the best way to approach this. It's been the best way to get help. It's been the best way to have my colleagues understand me rather than be afraid of me and be concerned that they can't rely on me. I'll talk about that more in a minute, but being open to me has been one of the best things that I could do for myself. I mentioned before individual and group therapy. Those are the foundation of my recovery. They're money in the bank for a rainy day. Even if I'm okay now, I'm not going to be okay at some point. I can guarantee you that. And that going to get these sorts of treatments are very helpful for me. Be or have a support system. So if you're a colleague, be a support system to others. If you're the person struggling, make sure that you have a support system. I have that within and without the law firm. I will say within the law firm, I am judicious about the people that I pick. You know, that's just common sense. Not everybody is going to be the person that you want to talk to and explain what's going on with you, but you will certainly find multiple people who are the right people. And again, I'm going to talk more as we go on about this, but advocate for yourself. Nobody can do it better.
Thanks. And just clinically, you want to let people know that you care, express your concern for them, and listen. And then it's really, we know this is a group where language is a big deal, so be direct. It is okay to ask someone if they are suicidal. It's a big myth that asking people if they're suicidal will cause them to become suicidal. That is a myth. It is okay to say, you know, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Are you thinking about suicide? So QPR stands for question, persuade, refer. You question the person, and you can question them about whether they're suicidal. You can question them, you know, I've noticed that you've been coming into work late. Is everything okay? They respond to you, and then you persuade them. So, you know, I know that you gave me a reason, but I'm very concerned about you. You know, lawyers have a higher rate of anxiety and depression than other professions. Would you consider getting help? And then you refer them, and Terry's going to tell you all about the great resources that are available. We don't want you to leave here thinking that you have to, in addition to being someone's attorney, also be their therapist. ACT is another quick thing. Acknowledge, care, tell. Acknowledge that something seems off. Express that you care and tell somebody. Okay, I think we need to wrap up.
All right, I'm going to just mention the final item on this slide because we're short on time. Taking care of yourself may require willingness to let the chips fall where they may. Nothing is worth losing your life. So think about that. People get caught up in the fact that they're responsible for supporting their families. They're failing people. They didn't get, as Stuart said, something didn't go right at the firm. Doesn't matter. Nothing is worth losing your life.
Thank you, guys. Moving into resources, I want to tell you that this Suicide Prevention Lifeline is one of the most important resources out there. It is a wonderful resource. If you're sitting there with your cell phone and you want to take time right now to put this number in your cell phone while I'm talking, I will not be offended. And trust me, if you find yourself talking to someone who is actively suicidal, you will be so grateful that you have that Suicide Prevention Lifeline right there in your phone. I'll tell you two quick personal experiences with this lifeline. The first was many years ago, the first time I went to do a presentation on suicide prevention and I was going to hand out this lifeline. It occurred to me that I'd never actually called it, and I didn't know if it really worked, and it was a 1-800 number, so I called the number to see what would happen, and to my shock, I recognized the voice on the other end of the phone. It was another lawyer here in Indianapolis who I knew, who was blocks away from me. I quickly said, "Hi, it's Terry. No, I'm not suicidal. I just want to make sure this really worked," and it did. It was kind of almost magical. Very cool. If you're out of town, you might want to use someone local's cell phone to call, or you're going to get help in the area where your cell phone is registered. Second thing is we put this number on our phone tree at work, and one evening after we were closed, one of our lawyer volunteers called us because he had a client in his office who was suicidal. He was hoping to talk to one of us, but he heard this option and pressed the Suicide Prevention Lifeline off of our phone tree and was able to get help for his client and prevent a suicide with his client. So it really does work, and I encourage you to spread the word and make that number available anywhere that you can. A newer version of this is the text line, crisis text line. It was created more recently, particularly it was designed for teenagers because they thought teenagers are unlikely to call for help, but they might text. But what they found is there's all kinds of people who would rather text. When you think about people in a domestic violence situation, just plain old introverts, and of course people who are depressed by nature. We know that they're unlikely sometimes to pick up the phone and talk to someone, but they might text that they needed help to someone. So this is another incredibly valuable resource. I haven't tested it yet, so someone else will have to do that. Your local lawyer assistance program. Lawyer assistance programs are confidential and they want to help lawyers, judges, law students with any kind of a mental health problem, including suicidal thinking. The confidentiality varies slightly state to state, so you might want to check with your own lawyer assistance program. We do have an exception for suicidal, homicidal behavior, but it's limited. We can only call those people necessary to assure safety. You know, I can call and talk to someone's psychiatrist or take them to an emergency room. I cannot call the disciplinary commission or the state bar or their law firm. It's just for safety purposes. The ABA has a listing of all the LAPs, so if you don't know how to contact the LAP in your state, you may go to the website or call the ABA Commission, and they will tell you how to make contact with your lawyer assistance program. There's also a national helpline for judges helping judges. We use a lot of peer support with our lawyers, but we found that with judges, there's such a small community of judges that sometimes they don't want to talk to a judge in their own state, but they might talk to a judge across the country in another state. And so this enables them to get help from each other through that helpline. Additional resources. When you're dealing with someone who is suicidal, you can't beat local hospital emergency rooms. You can call the local police and ask for a well-being check. I've only had to do that twice in 16 years in my job, and I will tell you, a lawyer called me, or I called him upon someone's request. I called him, and he told me that, yes, he was going to kill himself that evening. He had a gun in the basement, and he intended to do it. I offered to have a volunteer drive him to a stress center, and he would not accept that help. I finally hung up, called the police, asked for a well-being check. The police went to check on him. He was hospitalized for several weeks. He signed a release so I could talk to the hospital staff. But he got better. He's still practicing law. He's still alive today. And the only people I talked to, I broke confidentiality to talk to the police, and then he signed a release for the hospital. But no one else knows that, but that was absolutely necessary because he was going to kill himself that night. Just want to make that point. Local mental health centers, chaplains and pastors, therapists, and do check the materials for this presentation. We've included much more detailed information in the materials to get you help. Also, the panelists, please don't call us if someone is in your office and currently suicidal. It'll call us across the country. Call 911, call your local police, call a therapist locally. But if you want help with how to prevent suicides in your community or how to reach out to a colleague who you think is struggling, feel free to contact any one of us that participated in this program today. Finally, these are resources that will help you if you're wanting to make a difference in your community. Looking at preventing suicides. What can we do as a bar association, as a community? What can we do? These are wonderful resources. Lawyers with Depression is a wonderful resource for lawyers with depression, as it says. It's Dan Lukasik who's doing the next free CLE webinar for the ABA, I believe. You really should check that out. Kate, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk to us about what else we can do, what other action steps we can take.
Thanks. So I know we're running out of time. We want to make sure we get the questions and answers, but some things are just to talk about it. So if people say, you know, what do you do at lunch? Be willing to talk about the fact that you attended a webinar on a topic that is too often not discussed at all. MIT has an initiative where they're giving out those silicone wristbands, and they say TMAYD, stands for Tell Me About Your Day. The idea that just simply designating yourself as a safe person for someone to talk to about their day indicates that people matter. And so, you know, just again, being mindful, talking about that. Be mindful of language that we use. So trying not to say things like someone committed suicide or because it implies crimes or has a negative connotation, and you know, saying something like, oh, that person's so crazy. So just to be mindful of the language that's used around mental health. Stand up to the stigma. You know, ask if you're in a firm, you know, what are we doing to address lawyer well-being? Following groups that were just mentioned on the previous slide, like the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, the Dave Nee Foundation, following folks on Facebook and Twitter, that's all really helpful. Help to challenge that culture. If you're in a position of power at your law firm, what is it that you're doing to promote a culture of wellness? Model wellness yourself and practice some of the positive psychology tenets. We have just a quick a quick slide about how to stay well. I'm not sure. We show the airplane to just as a reminder that, you know, when the survey of law student well-being found that 86% of law students who took the survey said that they went into the field of law to help somebody, and so many of you perhaps went into the field of law in order to help somebody, and we just want to make sure that you take care of yourself first, and here are some things that you can do to do that, to stay well. And I think we'll move on to questions.
Right. Thank you, Kate. Lynn and Stuart, thank all of you for sharing your insights with us today. We are ready to address some of the questions that have come from our audience. Operator, would you provide the instructions to our audience?
Yes, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask a question, use the chat function in the lower left corner of the webinar. Type your question in the bottom field and click the send button. And before we take our first question, we will now give you your ABA participation verification code, required to receive CLE credit for this program. Copy this code. You will be asked to enter the code in the online attendance form following this program. The ABA participation verification code is 5, T as in Tango, 1, 6, F as in Foxtrot, S as in Sierra, S as in Sierra, 6. That code again is 5, T as in Tango, 1, 6, F as in Foxtrot, S as in Sierra, S as in Sierra, 6. Thank you.
All right. Let's start with some questions. I'm going to start off with actually just a request, not a question, from one of the attendees had asked that we please remind everyone that starting with a full physical by your primary physician can be very helpful. And I wanted to repeat that because that is often something we say in our lawyer assistance program. We find that busy lawyers sometimes haven't kept up with their basic physicals, very basic health care. And sometimes the symptoms that everyone has seen may be due to a thyroid condition or a hormone off balance or some kind of a other organic problem that needs to be treated. So that's always a wonderful place to start. Stuart, I'm going to start with a question for you. It says, what's the difference between clinical depression and just feeling depressed or blue?
Sure. I think it's important to understand that when we talk about clinical depression, we're talking about a serious health problem that affects the total person. We all have the blues or the blahs, the normal everyday ups and downs, but when that down mood, along with other symptoms, lasts for more than a couple of weeks, then the condition may be clinical depression. It's more extreme and more prolonged. The lows are lower. Periods spent in the emotional down periods are longer. So I think it's important to understand that difference.
Thank you very much. Kate, someone asked the question, would getting a divorce be a warning sign or put someone more at risk for suicide?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that in and of itself, you know, asking for a divorce might be indicative of that someone is at risk for suicide, but we do see with people, like sometimes breakups can be a trigger, or if it's part of a pattern of someone sort of withdrawing from everybody in their life. So, for example, no longer say they were part of a book club or, it's normal social outings, and they were cutting themselves off from all of that. So I guess that's sort of a yes or no. It could be if it was part of a pattern of cutting themselves off from social support and social connections. It could be. It also could be that sometimes a loss could trigger someone to have thoughts of suicide. So I don't know that thoroughly answered the question, but I would say it doesn't have to be, but it might be.
Raises the question, it sounds like. Question mark, go there.
Yes.
Lynn and Stuart, I'm going to ask you both this question. Came in from the audience, but I'm going to ask it same question to both of you. From your perspective, what is the most helpful thing that a work colleague, or say someone you went to law school, another lawyer you went to law school with, what's the most helpful thing that colleague could do if he would see another colleague who seems to be depressed, who appears to be struggling? Lynn?
Okay. To me, the most helpful thing would be to gently approach the colleague. And like I said, people do with me, just the gentle question, how you doing? Are you feeling okay? Maybe go out for coffee or something and talk about your life, and then see if the person will open up to you. Frequently, if you get somebody in an environment where you're feeling a little more at ease, where you can establish some trust, the person will open up to you. That's a case where, where I said don't tell your own story. If you're trying to draw someone out, sometimes it is helpful to tell your own story, because people respond when they think that you get what's going on with them.
Thank you.
Yes, I think that just being there to listen. But, the most important and sometimes most difficult step is asking for help. And so you need to kind of encourage folks in that regard. And you may have to take their hand and go with them to the doctor or agree to go with them to get the treatment that they need. And let me also answer a question that was asked that I saw, Terry, about insurance.
Yes.
My treatment was covered by insurance. I was very fortunate in that regard, but I know that changes or varies from individual to individual or group policies, depending on what you have.
Thank you. The idea of going with someone to seek help, Stuart, we see that in our Lawyers Assistance Program. People are very anxious, very reluctant. And when another lawyer walks a lawyer over to our office, says, I'll go with you and we'll meet with JLAP together, sometimes they meet in, sometimes they'll just stay in the lobby and let their friend meet with us essentially alone. That is very helpful in getting someone to make that initial step towards getting help. Kate, I have a question for you. This attendee writes, given the contributing factor of isolation and the speculation that the competitive nature of law school contributes to that, could you compare traditional law schools with law schools like CUNY Law that don't rank students and where students actually do work collaboratively and support one another in class and in test prep?
I think that's a great question, and we have been asked before about, is there a notable difference between law students that rank versus those that don't? And so, we promised that any of the schools that participated in the survey of law student well-being would not be, their names would not be revealed. The study that I can point someone to, though, is that, Yale Law School last spring published a study called Falling Through the Cracks, and it talks specifically about the mental health needs and issues of Yale Law students. And Yale is a school that does not do a traditional grading system, and the results in that particular study showed that law students had a tremendous amount of mental health and emotional needs. So I think that until there are law schools who are willing to, name themselves and participate in a study, about mental health and in a comparison way, we can't answer that question fully, but as I said, we do know of that study at Yale.
Let me also add, as far as law students go, I think the number one thing that can be done to help them is to make sure they understand that feeling anxious or depressed is common during law school, and just give them the resources that they need to find a healthy way to cope rather than self-medicating with alcohol or drugs.
Kate or Terry, this is Lynn. Can I pop in with one thing?
Absolutely.
I saw a question to me or a comment that is important to address. When I talked about going off of all medication, the person who posed this said, please make sure everybody knows that you should not do that unless you're under a doctor's care. I agree with that 100%. I used to play the game of, oh, I'm better now, I'm not going to take this medication anymore, or, well, this seems to work pretty well, on 50 milligrams, maybe 100 would be better. And those games don't work very well.
Thank you. I see 2 or 3 questions. I'm going to try and summarize them together, and I'm actually going to answer. I'm going to give my answer, but I invite my colleagues to also add to my answer. Several people were asking, how do you deal with defensiveness if you approach someone because you want to offer help or you're concerned about them and they get defensive and don't want to, are resistant to reaching out for help or deny having any problem and maybe even get angry at you for asking, how do you deal with that? What I would say, since we do a lot of that here, is first make sure you do it in the right setting. Make sure you can have a private conversation where nobody's rushing off to get to something important the next moment. Stick to factual observations. Do not make assumptions about what's going on because you might be wrong. And it's really not going to help. Even if you could diagnose them, throwing a diagnosis out there is not going to help them. You just want to stick to what you have observed and then ask, are you okay? Can I help? Because it may be something that you don't know anything about that's going on, different from what you're thinking, but you still open the door that way. And then offer them options because when we're under stress, we all narrow our thinking, and our ability to think of many different options and think flexibly is reduced. So you can help offer options for the person. If you've called, find some resources, either by calling your lab or resources. You have resources ready to offer. Most important thing is to treat the person as an adult who gets to make their own decisions, but let them know that you're there to help and leave that door open. Because sometimes it takes someone back a little bit when you say something, but the more they think about it, they realize, wait, she asked because, not to make fun of me or criticize me in some way, she asked because she cared, and maybe I'll go back and talk to her again. Other thoughts from any of the other panelists?
This is Lynn. One thought I have is the bottom line is you cannot help someone who doesn't want to be helped. That doesn't mean, like Terry said, that you don't offer and offer again, but as she said, they're responsible for their own decisions. They make their own choices. And I have run into people as well who say, I'm fine, leave me alone, and you have to respect that unless somebody's doing an intervention.
I think one of the things that I say is, rely on your lawyering skills. So in terms of the QPR, I mean, I'm not an attorney, but, in terms of gathering evidence, so you gather evidence and you say to the person, it's really not even that, it doesn't even have to be that emotional. You say, no, here's what I've noticed. I've noticed that you've been coming in late, or I noticed that there's something off with the way you present yourself. So you're gathering the evidence, and then you say, hey, I am concerned about this because it's out of character for you. And again, use those persuasive skills. I'm really concerned. This is something that is very common in our field, and I'd really like for you to get some help, and I'd be happy to make a phone call with you and hear some of the great resources. So I think that if we are able to have a script almost, I think it sometimes can be easier to have that difficult conversation.
Right. Question for Stuart and Lynn, both. Someone asks, what is the best way to relate your struggles with depression to your coworkers, especially if you feel it will not be well received?
Well, I can answer that. I had written a book, and I was about to publish it, and I went around to all of them, and I said, you see the name on that book? That's my name. That's going to be out in the public eye. Our clients are going to see it. I need to know if you're okay with this. And to a person, they were, and more than half of them came to my first book reading. I think openness, absolutely, just be open about it. I'm not trying to be in la-la land. That's not always going to be easy, but if you can figure out a way to get there, it's going to make getting help and encouraging other people to access the care that will help them a lot easier.
my initial, when I was initially diagnosed with depression, I went to our managing partner and simply told him what I was going through. That was communicated on a need-to-know basis in the firm at that time, but of course over the years I was more open about it as I began to speak publicly about it. But again, that's an individual choice, I think.
Thank you.
Let me pop in with one more thing. You know, we've talked a lot about stigma. In my opinion, the only way we are ever going to end that is if people start to be open. As long as it's a secret, as long as it's shameful, stigma is going to stick around and people will not get access to the care that they need.
I agree with that. And Terry, let me also add, there was one question about if the ABA opinions that I mentioned were available on the website. Yes, just plug those into Google and you'll be able to find them without any problems on the ABA website. Also, the Journal of Addiction Medicine study that was done by the ABA and the Hazelton Betty Ford Foundation that we mentioned is available for free online. I know that sometimes those are not open, but that is open, and I think you should be able to find it without any trouble.
Great point, Stuart. Great point. I think we probably have time for one more question. And I will, again, I'm going to, since I have the floor, I will add a piece to it, but I want the rest of my colleagues to weigh in on this. Someone asked, is there information on whether people in different areas of the law are more depressed or more happy than in other areas of the law? For instance, family law attorneys, is there more depression there or in other areas? And my two comments are, one, I think Larry Krieger's research indicated that smaller firm lawyers and government lawyers were actually happier than lawyers in big firms, which is kind of a surprise to some people, which is not the same thing as not having clinical depression, of course, but it correlates. My personal experience working in a lawyer assistance program is it has more to do with finding the right fit for each person. While one person might be happy, really happy in a large firm and miserable working at the public defender's office, it can be just the opposite for someone else. Other thoughts?
I would just add to what you said about Larry Krieger's research, which what he found. He said, a lot of public interest attorneys tend to be happy, and he really talks about how if we look at what makes people happy, it's just having a sense of purpose and a sense of autonomy. So that would speak to Terry's point about, finding what fits for each individual.
Thank you, Kate. That's all the time we have today. But I want to ask all the attendees who want CLE to stay on so that they get the instructions for how to obtain your CLE certificate, and they get the survey on their screen to take the survey, which you have to take in order to get CLE. I want to thank Dr. Bender, Lynn Garson, Stuart Monty for sharing their expertise and their experience with us today. On behalf of the ABA, I'm Terry Harrell. Thank you all for joining us today. Operator?
Thank you very much. On behalf of the American Bar Association, thank you for participating in this program. Today's program was part of the ABA Free CLE series sponsored by the American Bar Association, Center for Professional Responsibility, Commission on Lawyer Assistance Programs, and the Young Lawyers Division. Register now for the upcoming free CLE program, Mental Health Awareness 101, Battling Burnout and Depression, on Monday, April 18th. To view the program descriptions and all upcoming programs in the series, visit http://www.americanbar.org/CLE/free_CLE.html. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.